Edward Lucas volgt voor The Economist al ruim 20 jaar de ontwikkelingen in Centraal- en Oost-Europa. Eerder was hij correspondent voor The Independent en de BBC World Service. De ontwikkelingen in het Rusland onder Vladimir Poetin brachten Lucas tot het schrijven van een boek dat recent in Nederlandse vertaling verscheen onder de titel De Nieuwe Koude Oorlog. Hoe het Kremlin Rusland en de wereld bedreigt. Een uitdagende titel en een verontrustend boek van een betrokken journalist. Tijdens zijn recente bezoek aan Nederland spraken wij uitgebreid met Edward Lucas. Een gesprek dat begon met de vraag of wij terecht een hoge mate van urgentie waarnemen in zijn boek. Of anders geformuleerd, is Edward Lucas niet gewoon boos?
I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned for several reasons. I'm concerned because of what's happening in Russia. I'm concerned because of what's happening in Eastern Europe. And I'm concerned about what's happening in the West. And on all three things, I think people have been rather complacent. And there's this very deep feeling in the West that since 1991, Russia's no longer communist, therefore it must be okay, it's going to be a democracy. That maybe things go up, maybe they go down, but they always go forward. And I think that is wrong. It's a wrong analysis. It's not borne out by the facts. Things are going in the wrong direction in Russia, and it's affecting us here, and I wanted to wake people up.
Yeah. Is there a personal reason for your concern, in the sense of what is your relationship to Eastern Europe?
Well, I've spent 20 years dealing with Eastern Europe professionally, and it was also a big part of my childhood because I was brought up in Oxford in an academic family that was very involved in struggling for freedom behind the Iron Curtain. So even as a small boy, I remember watching my father pack a suitcase to go to Czechoslovakia, and in with his socks he also had a copy of Plato's Republic in Greek and a Greek New Testament. And I was very impressed, I think I must have been 12 or 13 at the time, that he was risking his freedom to smuggle these books to philosophers who had been sacked from their jobs because of what they believed in and were working as stokers and window cleaners and were risking their freedom to meet him and discuss these old books. And I'm not a Russophobe, I'm a Russophile. I like Russia and Russians very much, and I feel really miserable about the way in which the country's been hijacked by these people and its development's been stunted. And I also care very much about the countries of Eastern Europe, the former captive nations, which I was very involved in the 1980s. And watched
Involved in what way?
I was a correspondent there, and I was a student in communist Poland and in divided Berlin. And I was delighted when the evil empire collapsed and these countries became free again, and some of my friends went from being dissidents to being foreign ministers or even presidents, and this was a great thing for me. And I don't want it to go backwards.
Mm-hmm. Now, the main thesis of your book is that the current leadership of Russia is, in fact, a takeover of the FSB, the former KGB, the Secret Service. And you go back a long time tracing that development. You say, in fact, it started more than 20 years ago with the short reign of Yuri Andropov as Secretary General of the then Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think the Soviet Union was a mixture of the communist one-party state, the planned economy, and secret police terror under the KGB. And the two of those elements collapsed. The one-party state collapsed because of Gorbachev trying to make the system more open and pluralistic, which immediately meant communist rule became unsustainable, and the planned economy just didn't work. And so both those elements disappeared, and Russia became a multi-party country, and it became a capitalist country, more or less. But the KGB never really went away. There was a brief period, as you've mentioned, under Andropov, just before the perestroika, glasnost period, when one could say rather loosely that the KGB was running the country.
Because Andropov was KGB.
Because Andropov was KGB, but that was that was rather temporary. And Andropov died. And then under Gorbachev, the KGB rather took a back seat because they could see that the old system wasn't working and they wanted it to improve. And then when Yeltsin came in, there was a brief period when the KGB was really unsettled because we'd seen the crowds outside the Lubyanka, the wonderful moment when the statue of that appalling murderer, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was pulled down. And Yeltsin was...
Who was the former of the KGB,
the founder of the KGB, yes. And there was just a brief moment when it really looked as though that third element of Soviet power was also going to go. But unfortunately it didn't. And the KGB was chopped up into 4 or 5 different bits, and they were all relabeled. But they began to get their act together again. A lot of them went into business and made some money in business. And when I say KGB, it's more of a mindset than an organisation, because it would be wrong to say the FSB is running the country now. The FSB is one of the very important organs of state, along with the prosecutor's office, the interior ministry, and so on. But it's really this, what I call the Chekisti. The Cheka was Lenin's secret police, the first of the communist secret police, and Chekist is a kind of Russian slang word for anyone from this kind of background. And it's those people who are in positions of such huge power and who came along with Mr. Putin in 1999, slowly at first, and then more of them, and have got not only the political power but also economic power, because the same people who run the Kremlin also run the biggest companies in Russia, and quite blatantly.
Now, what would a development like that compare to if you translate it to Western European situation?
Well, if you imagine that the Third Reich had not been defeated in 1945 but had staggered on till the 1980s, with in the end being brought down by a kind of reform Nazi who tried to reform the system but in fact ended up collapsing it, just as Gorbachev did. If you imagine then we had 10 years of chaos with a German federation, rather like the Russian Federation, taking over as the core of the old Third Reich, but countries such as the Netherlands, Denmark and so on getting back their independence, just as the Baltic states did from the Soviet Union. And if you then imagine that in 1999 a former SS colonel called Waldemar Pushnik becomes first Prime Minister, then President, and now most recently becomes Prime Minister again, we might feel pretty queasy about that. We might think the SS was actually a pretty bad organisation. And then the realists might say, oh, but Colonel Pushnik was in the Foreign Intelligence Division of the SS, and that wasn't so bad, and it's a long time since the Holocaust, and you mustn't be too moralistic about this. And we might think, oh, okay, we've got to try and calm down. And we might put up with that. But if you then imagine that this German federation, run by the former SS Colonel Waldemar Pushnik, starts saying that the Anschluss was legal, that the march into the Rhineland was okay, that the Munich Agreement and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia was okay, we feel pretty upset. That's how the Poles and the Balts feel about the way in which Putin said the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was okay. And if you then had official mainstream German media saying there were no gas chambers at Auschwitz, we'd find that pretty outrageous. And that's what we've got with the Russian media, on 4 occasions since the summer, saying the Katyn massacre of 20,000 Polish officers shot in cold blood by the NKVD was the work of the Nazis, not of the Soviets. That was the classic Stalinist mixture, first the crime and then the lie. And that kind of historical revisionism it's dreadful for Russia, and it's really scary for the East Europeans, and I think we haven't taken it seriously enough here.
Now, there is a crucial moment in this development because, as you say, the power of the KGB or the FSB, of the Chekists, as you have it, was diminished in the period of Yeltsin. Then there is a crucial moment when Yeltsin appoints Vladimir Putin as his successor. Why did he do that?
The Yeltsin regime was really completely bankrupt by the end. The corruption was extraordinary. Yeltsin himself was physically in a very bad way. He'd already gone a long way down this road. He had a chief of his bodyguards, Kozhakov, was a very unpleasant character who wanted to have a coup, in fact, because he was worried that Yeltsin was not going to be re-elected in 1996, and instead they went down the road of vote rigging, instead in a way that Mr. Putin has also gone down, with the media all on Yeltsin's side and the falsification of the count and so on. So things were going wrong even before then. But I think that this was a last desperate throw of the dice by the Yeltsin family, that they couldn't see any way of avoiding impeachment. The Duma was going to impeach them. They tried all sorts of very crude bribery to try and keep the Duma, the Russian parliament, from causing trouble, but it was becoming more and more difficult. The big, powerful regional politicians were against them. And I think they turned to Putin as someone, and the Chekists, as the one organisation that would be able to keep them out of jail. And in a way, they swapped their freedom for the country's freedom. So Russia was consigned to the rule of the old KGB, but the Yeltsin family stayed out of prison.
Yeah. Now you say it's not the FSB as an organization so much ruling Russia at the moment, but the mentality of the Chekists. At the moment that Yeltsin asked Putin to be his successor, was there something of a plan, or was it something happening? Was it the occasion to which they jumped?
Well, I think they tried before. If you remember, it perhaps seems a long time ago now, but before we'd had Putin, his predecessor was Stepashin, who was also a Silovik, one of these ex-KGB people, although in a rather disguised way. And before him it was Primakov, who'd been a spy in the Soviet era. So they'd had two other attempts, but in each case it hadn't worked. Primakov was flirting with the regional power barons, and Stepashin had other disadvantages. And so Putin was, if you like, the third try, but the most successful one. And I fear, it's a horrible conspiracy theory, but I think that it's probably true, that they had decided to have some kind of mass terror event in order to panic the population. There was a lot of talk about this even before Putin came in, that they were planning to do something called Operation Whirlwind, which was going to involve some kind of public violence. And I think the apartment bombings in late 1999, in which hundreds of people were killed, murdered in their beds by these mysterious explosions.
Some apartment buildings in Moscow, two in Moscow,
in Volgodonsk and Brunais and other places. And then most mysteriously the one in Ryazan where the bomb didn't go off. And this created the perfect background for Putin to go, as I put it in the book, from zero to hero. He was a completely unknown bureaucrat in the summer who ran the FSB without great distinction, just as he'd run everything else without great distinction. And then suddenly there was this guy saying, we're going to wipe out these terrorists in the shithouse, and talking very toughly at a time when Russians were feeling we must have a strong hand.
Is there any proof for FSB involvement in these apartment building bombings?
The only proof is in the one that didn't go off, because it's clear that the sacks, which may have contained explosive, and according to the initial tests it contained explosives, but then were said to contain only sugar, that these sacks were planted in the basement of an apartment building in Ryazan by two FSB people from Moscow. That is agreed. The question is whether it was an exercise, or whether
as the FSB had it,
as the FSB later claimed, or whether it was a bomb, a real bomb, which was just discovered. Because the story of the people living in the apartment block, which makes a lot of sense, is that they saw people carrying sacks into the building. They went down. They found timers, detonators, and what looked like small pasta, which was just what hexogen looks like, little grains. And it was reported, the police came, they took it away, it was announced an explosive, and everybody said, this is a bomb which has been foiled. Great, well done. And that would have been a good story in a way, good work by the public, staying alert. Yeah. And then they said, but we got the number plate of the people who planted these sacks, and a telephone operator intercepted a phone call from two guys phoning FSB headquarters in Moscow saying, we've been spotted, we have to get out. And then they were arrested. And then the story changed. They said it was just a drill, it was sugar, it was to test public alertness. And so we're asked to believe that two FSB guys from Moscow go to Ryazan, buy sacks of sugar in the market, buy cartridges at a gun shop to act as the detonator, have a timer with them, and then plant these sacks in an unguarded basement of an apartment block in order to test public readiness, and do so using a stolen car. And it just doesn't make sense. This is, even the Russian FSB does not organise practice drills in such a chaotic manner. Now, it's possible it was all a terrible cock-up, and if so, it would be very easy for the authorities to prove. They could have had an inquiry, and they could explode this conspiracy theory quite easily, but they haven't. And so I'm reluctantly drawn to the conclusion, which many Russians and many serious Russian politicians also believe, that this was part of a dreadful plan of mass murder organised in order to make Putin look good.
Now, initially, Mr. Putin looked good to the West too. He posed and acted as a